Wishing each and every one of you a happy new year. I hope that 2023 brings with it a lot of fulfilment and prosperity to as many South Australians as possible, including all those present here in this room today. Can I firstly introduce the gentleman I'm with this morning? Of course, Murray Watt, who is the responsible minister that we have been working so closely with regarding this emergency situation in the state of South Australia around the flooding, along with Joe Sockarch, the Minister for Emergency Services, and of course Chris Beattie, the Chief of the SES as the control agency for this disaster. Today we are here to announce probably the biggest funding package we have seen in the state's history in respect to a recovery effort around an emergency. This has been work that has been undertaken over the course of the last few weeks between both the state government and the federal Albanese government. And I just want to put on my thanks to the Prime Minister and Minister Watt for their extraordinary collaborative efforts with the state government over recent weeks to put this package together. I think it demonstrates a very committed understanding of exactly what is happening on the ground throughout river communities in the state of South Australia throughout the course of this flooding event. And the understanding, of course, lends itself to a big recovery effort that we know is on its way in South Australia. Chris Beattie will go through a bit of details in respect to where the peak is at the moment and how much longer we expect the flooding to be with us for, because we know there is still some way to go yet, to say the least. But we are actively turning our minds to recovery because we do know it's going to be a very substantial undertaking indeed. And that is going to take resources and that is going to take money. So to be able to have the assistance of the federal government is something that is very much appreciated by all South Australians. On a personal note, I also just want to thank the Prime Minister and Minister Watt for devoting much of their time to having an on-the-ground presence. We know Albo was here some weeks ago and was able to see firsthand what was coming and the preparations that were underway. And Minister Watt has been to South Australia on more than one occasion and is out touring river communities again this afternoon along with Minister Sockarch. And having them on the ground to see what's happening firsthand, but talking to people, talking to homeowners, business owners, to understand exactly what's happening has been really productive and worthwhile and allowed for an expedited process to get to this point today. Today, we do announce an additional $126 million worth of funding, jointly funded through this Commonwealth and the state government, to prepare us for the recovery effort in front of us. That $126 million package brings the total funding to this disaster now to $178 million between the state government and the Commonwealth. This is the biggest funding package to any disaster in our understanding in the state's history. It demonstrates just how serious we are to do the preparatory work, but then to do the recovery as well, because the cleanup effort is going to be big. It's going to take a lot of manpower. It's a lot of effort from men and women across the state, but it's also going to take a lot of resources that requires a collaborative effort between the Commonwealth, the state government and local government in particular. Just to outline some of the details of this $126 million worth of new money today, it starts with the property assessment and power connection effort. Many of you have heard me refer to the fact that we expect that somewhere in the order of 4,000 different properties will have to have an individual certification from an electrician to be able to have their power reconnected. We've already got 200 Sparkies that we've identified across the state who will lend themselves to prioritising this effort, but that will also require some funding and assistance. $10 million has been allocated to that effort, and I can go into a little bit of detail if you like about how we intend to administer that $10 million. An additional $9.3 million for small business recovery grants for up to $50,000 per small business. Now that's on top of the eligibility for the $10,000 that the state government is providing to this effort as well. So this means that small businesses will now be able to get access to up to $60,000 to be able to get them back on their feet, servicing their communities, employing local people as quickly as possible in river communities. Primary producers will be eligible for up to $45.9 million, so that is $50 million worth of funding for grants up to $75,000 per primary producer. This will enable them to be able to fund the rebuilding of fences, refund the rebuilding of levees, the sorts of things that we know have big costs associated, maybe even pumping infrastructure. This will go a long way to assisting primary producers that are very much the backbone of the economy in so many of our river communities. Waste management. Now, this is the big doozy. We know that the cleanup effort is going to be big on both public property but also private property as well. So $60 million has been allocated towards the cleanup of removing all of that waste that is going to be associated with the flood event after the waters have receded. We know from interstate experience, and this is something we've been paying a lot of attention to, particularly where we saw the New South Wales and Queensland floods, but we know when the waters recede, there is a lot of waste that is left behind that can really act as a prohibitor for people to be able to enjoy the comfort of their own homes or their local communities. So the more resources we can get on the ground around that cleanup, the sooner, the better. Now, local government can't do this alone. So the state government is going to actively coordinate much of this effort through a jointly funded exercise from the federal government and the state government to assist those 9 local council areas being able to fix this cleanup effort as quickly as we possibly can. It is going to take time. It's going to take patience, and there are going to be challenges, but we're not leaving any stone unturned when it comes to the funding of this massive cleanup effort. We've also got funding towards more discrete, specific areas around cleanup. We know that black water will make its way into the South Australian river system sooner rather than later, and that will bring with it fish kills. So we're allocating $800,000 explicitly towards the large-scale fish cleanup effort that is going to be required. This is something that, if you can address it sooner rather than later, it will make a big difference on the ground. More than that, I just want to mention this because we often focus on the negative, but there are going to be very substantial environmental and ecological benefits that come with this flooding event in the medium and the long term. But in the short term, there is going to be damage as well. And a fish kill is something that we do anticipate will occur, particularly after waters come off the floodplains and then take all those nutrients and other things into the river system, and we start to see black water and a fish kill event occur. So $800,000 has been allocated towards that. And also we've got a discrete effort around additional funding towards legal assistance which people may require as the cleanup and the recovery effort endures. I would say this, we've been working closely with the Insurance Council of Australia and I thank them for their assistance. We hope that learnings that they've received from flooding events in other jurisdictions in years gone by and more recently as well serves insurers well to be able to look after their customers. I know that the federal government and the state government will have no hesitation in holding insurance companies to account in honouring their obligations to their customers and clients, but most importantly to Australians in need. But up until this point, there's been a lot of active collaboration with the Insurance Council of Australia, and we do thank them for that. But between this $126 million that we've announced today and the in excess of $50 million that has been contributed from the state government more recently, we've now got what is essentially a $180 million package to support South Australians in their time of need. I said from the outset, when we started to become aware of the scale of the challenge coming our way, that we weren't going to leave a single stone unturned when it comes to preparedness. And I think most of you have seen that work quite well up until this point. We know there are challenges. We know there are people being displaced. We know there are businesses closing down. But we have done everything we can to prepare ourselves for this situation, and that has largely stood people in good stead. It stood our emergency service volunteers and workers in good stead, but most of all, it's looked after people in their time of need. But outside of the preparations, we were always going to have to turn our efforts to the cleanup and the recovery efforts. And you can see from this $180 million package that we're serious about it, and we want to do it right as best as we possibly can, notwithstanding the fact that we know that there clearly will be difficulties and challenges that present themselves along the way. I'll just give you one little, for instance, and a bit of a shout out before I invite Minister Watt to say a few words about something that happened recently that I'm not too sure got much. I think it's got a little bit of attention in the media, but little things sometimes make a difference as well. And this is where I want to give a bit of credit to the local MPs on the ground from the other side of politics. Both Tim Whetstone, the member for Chafee, and Adrian Pederick, the member for Hammond, have been in regular contact with me and my team and pointed out little things that need to be addressed or fixed, and I want to thank them for it. You know, I think what people want to see in times like this are, you know, political parties to become a low order consideration, and what is the top order consideration is looking after local communities. And both those local MPs, I think, have been genuine in wanting to raise issues with the government to be responded to. Just the other day, Adrian Pederick texted me asking if there was any chance the state government could fund a bus shuttle service in Mannum, because there were car parking issues with a lot of South Australians going up and checking out what was happening in Mannum, and there were potentially opportunities being missed out from local businesses just because there was nowhere to park. And within 24 hours, we were able to have a bus service up and running in Mannum there, funded from the state government and organised by the local government. So I just think it's a little example, but it just speaks to a genuine effort that we've all putting in here. And I do want to acknowledge the work of those two Liberal MPs who I think have been sincere in their efforts and has certainly assisted the state government doing its bit where we can. But we're here today to talk about this big package, and we couldn't have done that without the active collaboration from Minister Watt and his team in the Albanese government. And we just can't thank can't thank the Minister enough for his sincerity in wanting to be engaged with the events on the ground, and then that resulting in the outcome that we're able to announce today. So thank you, Minister.
Thanks very much, Premier. It's a pleasure to join with you, your Minister, Joe Sockarch, and the SES Commander, Chris Beattie, on a very early start to the year, but an important start to the year for South Australians. And can I, from the beginning, commend the efforts of the South Australian Government, the South Australian Emergency Services, both professional staff and volunteers, and South Australian communities more generally, for the incredible preparedness that we've seen in the weeks leading up to this event. Unlike some other states, I guess South Australia has had the advantage of having some advance warning of what would be coming down the Murray. And South Australia, whether it be in government or in communities, has banded together to make sure that these river communities are as well prepared as they possibly can be for what is a very large flood. Now, we know that with the best will in the world and all of that preparedness work, we can't stop every piece of flood damage occurring, and we can see some of that unfolding in South Australia right now. But I think we can all acknowledge that that huge effort that so many people have put in over the last few weeks, and indeed over the last couple of months, has meant that the damage will not be as severe as it otherwise would have been. So congratulations to everyone who has done that, particularly the fact that people have had to be working very long hours on this through the holiday period rather than spending that time with their loved ones. The Premier's right. We have engaged very closely with the South Australian Government from before this disaster hit and as it has rolled on. I've personally been in South Australia twice already, both before the floods and in the Riverland as the peak approached there. And now today I'll be joining Minister Sockarch heading out east into places like Mannum, Murray Bridge, and a number of other smaller communities as well, to see what's likely to be happening there and how well prepared we are for the damage that we're already starting to see in some of those communities. The Prime Minister, of course, was also in Renmark with the Premier before the flood peak arrived, and the point of those visits was to really make sure that we were as best informed as we possibly could be about what was coming, about what was happening in terms of preparedness, and what might be needed from the federal government in terms of recovery support once those disasters hit. And I think it is that early work that's occurred between both federal and state officials that has meant that we've been able to come out quite quickly after some of these peaks and announce what is a very large package of flood support for South Australians. I won't go through the details of that again. The Premier has gone through those details, but in short, this package involves significant support for South Australian households, primary producers, councils and many other groups who are going to be impacted by these floods. And I guess my message more than anything today is to say that the federal government, the Albanese government, is working absolutely in lockstep with the Malinauskas government here in South Australia, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with South Australians, whether they've been already hit by these floods or whether they may be in the days and weeks ahead. I might just hand over to Commander Beattie first, and then happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. I'd like to reiterate the Premier and Minister Watts' comments about our hard-working volunteers across all the emergency services, as well as the staff and support agencies that have really lent in over the last couple of weeks. It has been a particularly busy operational period over the New Year's season, and we've had crews right across all River Murray communities responding to any number of incidents and requests for assistance. We know that the flows at the border continue to decline, and as of yesterday, they're around the 166 gigalitre a day mark. Upstream, we continue to see a fall in the river levels across places like Lirrup, Berry, and also Renmark. And the peak flow is currently sitting at Lock 4, and we're expecting that to reach Cobdogla later today and Waikerie over the next 4 days or so. We continue to see those river levels tracking higher, slightly higher than the 1931 flood levels. It does vary from location to location, and we're currently quite interested in the higher river levels at Lock 1 around Blanchetown, which are tracking quite a bit higher than the rest of the river in terms of those river heights. We're also keeping a close eye on Lake Alexandrina, particularly with the high tides. We may see the height of Lake Alexandrina get up around that 1.3 metres. Above that, we start to have a few concerns around low-lying properties. So we'll be doing some work with our hydrologists and Department of Environment and Water to just make sure that those communities are adequately aware of the risk, should we see some higher lake levels. In terms of other impacts, we continue to see those disconnections of power that we've been forecasting. As at 4 o'clock this morning, there was 3,190 disconnections had been completed by South Australian Power Networks. We've got 9 of the ferry crossings closed. Tailem Bend is still operating. That's likely to be closed down in the coming days as we see road impacts occur from flooding. And the Cadell and Narung ferries, we expect they'll continue to remain open throughout this event. We've got 119 roads closed across the area, and I'm pleased to say that we've had a successful deployment of the defence cell barriers, around 350 metres of flood protection on the Goyder Highway, which has allowed that to reopen, including a small detour which facilitates two-way traffic. We completed some analysis from high-resolution satellite data that was provided through the Australian Government, along with inundation mapping towards the end of December. Currently, we know that there's 3,400 properties that are residences of some form or nature that have flooding over the property. That doesn't mean they're fully inundated. And of those, around 393 are primary residences. So again, it's not an exact picture of the level of impact, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the number of properties that have had flooding across their premises. In terms of more operational activities, we've had crews heavily engaged at Mannum, where a number of stormwater infrastructure failures have led to flooding in behind the levee, particularly in Mary Ann Reserve, and also more recently in behind the Visitor Information Centre. We've had contractors on site attempting to mitigate that flooding from the stormwater systems. That's included a number of activities, including high-volume pumping strategies, coupled with temporary bunding to allow the water to equalise with the river level. We've also had a number of levees fail over the last couple of days. Again, as forecast, a number of the lower-lying agricultural levees and private levees are either overtopping or failing, with yesterday Long Island, Long Flat and Pomputa levees either overtopping or breaching, and Wharf Flat breaching on the 1st of January. Most of these levees primarily protect the river flats, reclaimed land for farming, and we've been working closely with the dairy farmers along with other farming enterprises to ensure they're well prepared and they relocate stock from impacted areas.
Any questions?
I was going to say, is this the sum total of assistance, or is it going to be assessed on an ongoing basis and possibly adjusted depending on the circumstances?
Sure. No, this isn't necessarily the end of support for South Australia. Of course, what the federal government does is rely very heavily on state governments to provide advice as to what assistance is needed. State governments are obviously closer to the ground than we are in Canberra. But as the Premier mentioned, this is not the first instalment of funding that has been provided through these floods. Obviously, the South Australian government has made small business assistance available already, as well as other forms of assistance. And in fact, there is already joint funding available, jointly funded by the federal and state governments for things like financial hardship support for councils. That was announced a number of weeks ago. So this has been done in instalments, and as the situation unfolds, if further assistance is required, then we'd of course consider that.
And will this additional money flow immediately?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. This support is available as of today, and people who would like to seek this support can go to either the South Australian Government's flood website or to the Australian Government's disaster assistance website, and all of the eligibility criteria and the exact details of these grants will be published there.
And how does this package compare to what other states have received in terms of flood recovery?
Well, as the Premier said, to our knowledge, this is the largest disaster support package that's ever been provided to South Australia, and it would be comparable in size to states of other population size. It wouldn't surprise you to know that places like New South Wales and Victoria, with a higher population and with even more extensive damage compared to what we've seen in South Australia, have received even more financial support. But I know that the support that South Australia is receiving is, for example, larger than what Tasmania is receiving as a smaller state there. So it's generally reflective of population size and the extent of the damage and the extent of the area being impacted. But there's no doubt that this is a very big flood for South Australia that is affecting a very large part of the community, and hence it's a pretty large package.
So this is higher than even any bushfire disaster, even Ash Wednesday?
I suppose I'm relying on the Premier's advice here, but to our knowledge it is. Obviously that was some time ago, so it wouldn't be surprising if dollars have gone up. But it is a very significant package of support, and again reflects the extensive damage that we've seen across a large part of the state.
In terms of these small business grants, will they just be available for people that have had them completely closed down, or is this a case of similar to the package we saw a couple of weeks ago from the Premier?
It's a little bit different to what the South Australian Government has already announced. I'd encourage people to go to the website to get the exact details, but in broad terms, the grants that we're announcing today are for small businesses who have suffered some kind of flood inundation in their businesses. It most likely would mean that they have had to close operations for a period of time, but it may not be the case in every case. The assistance that the state government had already announced, my understanding, was more directed towards businesses who may not have been directly flood inundated, but have suffered some sort of financial loss as a result of those floods. But the bigger grants that are being announced today, the jointly funded ones, are particularly for businesses who have actually received floodwaters into their business.
Just on some other topics, just in relation to the situation in China, what impact do you think the huge COVID wave there will have on our supply chains? Jim Chalmers has said it could be huge.
Yeah, as you say, Jim Chalmers has addressed this both yesterday and today, and I think there's no doubt that the increasing wave of COVID in China will have quite a serious impact on the Australian economy and on our supply chains. We know that the COVID zero policy that China had been pursuing up until recently was also having an impact on supply chains. If you speak to any business around, whether it be in South Australia or other parts of the country, they'll be able to tell you about the difficulties that they've had getting parts and other inputs into the country from China for some time. But I think there's no doubt that this will have quite a serious impact for some time to come.
On that topic, why did your government ignore the advice of the Chief Medical Officer when it came to imposing restrictions on travellers from China?
Well, you will have seen the letter that the Chief Medical Officer provided in today's media, and we have actually accepted a number of recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer. For instance, testing wastewater in airlines that are coming in from China, and that's particularly to try to get a grip on what kind of variants might be in China at the moment. And that's the fundamental issue here, is that even the World Health Organization made the statement on the weekend that China, unfortunately, has not been transparent as to the types of variants that are in place, the numbers of people who are affected, and that's why Australia is one of a number of countries around the world that has taken this action.
So is this more a political decision to make this call?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, we obviously listened to the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, but we've also been influenced by the advice of other health experts, such as the World Health Organization. And over the weekend, the World Health Organization made a very clear statement that they were concerned about the lack of transparency that China was displaying and the impact that was having on people's ability to track variants to COVID-19, something that's very important from a World Health perspective. So we've taken into account a range of that advice and now taken what we consider to be a modest measure, simply asking people to be tested before they get on an airline, just like more than a dozen other countries have done. And we're doing this really out of an abundance of caution.
Throughout the pandemic, though, the government of the day has always taken the advice of the Chief Medical Officer. Why all of a sudden is the government abandoning his advice?
Well, I wouldn't say we're abandoning his advice. As I say, there are a number of recommendations that the Chief Medical Officer made that we have taken up, and I've already given you a couple of examples of those. But there is other health advice available to us from the World Health Organization, which is monitoring this situation worldwide. And just as a number of other countries have taken this step, a modest step, we have decided to do so as well.
Just on another topic out of Victoria, Dan Andrews says the federal government needs to fix Medicare because it's broken, pushing more into crowded hospitals. Do you agree?
I think that there's no doubt that after 10 years of Liberal National Party government, Medicare was damaged. Medicare is a proud Australian achievement, the universal right to have health care, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, and no matter what your income. And I know from personal experience that it's become harder and harder for people to get GP appointments. I come from Queensland, a very decentralised state, and it's very difficult for people to be able to get bulk billed appointments or even just any GP appointments. So that's why the Health Minister, a proud South Australian, Mark Butler, is doing so much work with his Medicare task force to try to rebuild Medicare. We've already put a lot more money in the system. Obviously, we just announced or began the cheaper medicines policy on January the 1st as well. So we're putting significant resources into the health system to repair a decade of damage that we saw from the Liberal and National parties.
Dan
Just some of the
Andrews says that
practical-
I'll come to you next. Yep. Sorry.
Just on the same topic, Dan Andrews says that should include the feds paying for extra hospital beds because the NDIS issue is pushing people into hospitals who should be dealt with elsewhere. Do you think that's the case? Should be paying for more hospital beds?
Well, I'll leave it for Mark Butler to address the specifics of what Premier Andrews has said, but we are taking a number of steps, not just in terms of funding the Medicare system better, not just in terms of funding the hospital system better, but as you say, the issues that we've seen with the NDIS, the complete breakdown in aged care in this country, again over the last 10 years, has put immense pressure on our public hospitals. So we are taking steps across a range of these issues with the aim of relieving pressure in state public hospitals.
What are some of the practical measures the federal government's making this year, though, in relation to Medicare? Can you name some of those?
Well, as I say, we've already commenced the cheaper medicines policy that started on the 1st of January, which will make a huge difference to people's cost of living and the cost of receiving healthcare through the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. In addition to that, Mark Butler has a Medicare task force underway, which is consulting most of the experts, including the AMA and all sorts of other health experts as to how we can rebuild Medicare in this country. It's a high priority for this government, and I'm sure Mark will have more to say about that over the year.
Just on a separate topic, Iranian warships have been seen travelling to Australia's region. Should we be concerned?
I am not aware of that, so it's probably best that I don't comment on that. Thank you.
Any other questions on funds, folks?
Just for the Premier. How are we managing how much money is needed? Obviously, the federal minister has said more money could flow if South Australia needs it. How will we assess whether that's the case?
Essentially on the basis of need. So what we've been trying to do from the outset is identify need and seek to address it where we can. Clearly, there are a range of people who are insured, whether they're businesses, homeowners, shack owners, and we're not seeking to duplicate the efforts of those that are insured or insurance companies. But where we identify a need that isn't able to be met, then we want to address it. Now, I think it's fair to say that local governments, particularly in regional communities don't necessarily have the balance sheets to be able to undertake the sort of response that is required for an event of this scale. And that's why the state government's been so active in supporting local government. Everything from shuttle buses to whole new levies being built around towns. But then there's another level of support again that the state governments always are going to require assistance from the Commonwealth for. And when we think about where to from here, clearly what we'll be analysing at the first available opportunity is how much damage has been done to infrastructure once the waters recede. We literally have no idea how much damage is being done to many state government, even federal government roads that currently just can't be seen because they're inundated. So I think it'll take some time before we start to get a true picture of how much funding will be required to fix the infrastructure. But when that occurs, we'll assess it, and if there's a need to work with the Commonwealth on that, then we know from the federal government that they're willing to hear those calls and then work through it on a pragmatic and responsible basis.
And in terms of this small business support, do you think that goes far enough to help those whose businesses are completely shut down and for those affected where tourists can't visit because they can't use the river right now?
Look, a lot of businesses have access to insurance, but what we've been wanting to do is really step up to the plate. I'll invite you to cast your minds back, less than 12 months ago. I made it clear that I wanted to lead a pro-business state Labor government, and I think that the sort of things that government should be doing in that context is supporting businesses in their most dire times of need, particularly where they're suffering loss through no fault of their own. And that's why we've tried to go above and beyond with the early business closure grants, and then on top of that, the downturn grants, and then working with the Albanese government on this latest iteration of business support with a $50,000 grant and then up to $75,000 for primary producers. This is a lot of money that'll make a big difference to people, and that's the right thing to do.
How much money has been paid out so far to people impacted?
Yeah, it depends on the grant or the budget line we're talking about. I've got some stats to give you some context for some of them. So for the early business closure grant, thus far there's been 141 applicants. For the generator grant, there's been 166. So in some areas we've seen demand for some of this support lower than what we may have anticipated up until this point, which is probably not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing, but because it means people are otherwise prepared and able to handle it, or things aren't necessarily bad as what they first may have appeared that they might be. But we also know that, as Chief Beattie mentioned, the peak is still quite high up the river, and it's got a long way to go yet. That's the first point. The second point is, just when the peak passes doesn't mean you go back to a normal river flow. Some of you would recall me mentioning that normally the average around this time of the year for the last decade is somewhere around about 15 gigalitres a day coming across the border. We've had almost 200. Now, once the peak passes, we don't go straight down to 15, it takes time. So this event is going to be with us for some time, and we anticipate that the call on these resources will grow, particularly once we start to transgress into recovery phase. So, take property owners who have vacated their property. They could be homeowners, or they could be shack owners or primary producers. They're currently not on the ground, but when they return, they'll start to see the scale of the requirement around cleanup, and that's where we want this to support to really be able to kick in.
And how's the timeline there for the payouts? We have heard that some generator grants have been quite slow, or people haven't heard back.
Yeah, are you referencing in respect to there was a gentleman on ABC?
I think he's been waiting a week.
Yeah, I've been able to chase that up quickly, and my understanding is that application went in. There was, I'm advised that there was more information sought than that was eventually granted, and then there's a run of payments tomorrow, and I understand that gentleman will receive that payment in tomorrow's run of payments. But we've really tried to be as expeditious as possible when it comes to the delivery of these grants, and that's largely what's happened.
Premier, we've been sent a video, you may have seen a still image of it. A group of teenagers coercing or appearing to coerce a couple of young kids in Port Augusta overnight into a fight. Just wanted to get your reaction from that. It's obviously a pretty sickening vision.
Yeah, I haven't seen the vision. I've just seen the still. when you talk about young kids, you hope that people older than them are giving them a good example about, you know, how to lead a good life. And you got to wonder what's going through the minds of older people to actively facilitate and encourage this sort of behaviour. It would be very disconcerting indeed. It's hard for me to comment on without seeing the vision directly, but when we're talking about young people, they're looking for guidance. They're looking for assuredness about how to live a good life, and that sort of behaviour is not consistent with the best traditions of what we try and do as mature people in Australia. So I hope that if there have been any breaches to the law in this instance, that people are held to account accordingly. What I would say is I understand, and I'm doing this from second-hand knowledge, I'll qualify remarks accordingly, but I understand that vision was taken from a mobile phone. Look, I mean, we're seeing a greater prevalence of people using mobile phones and recording them for, you know, inappropriate behaviour or actively encouraging inappropriate behaviour, particularly acts of violence amongst young people. That is not okay. And that is why we've introduced a policy that is being rolled out this year to ban mobile phones in schools. It's one of the things that we've seen called for some time, and there's been a degree of inaction. I promised the people of South Australia that I was going to ban mobile phones from classrooms, and that's a policy that's now being rolled out this year. It's not universally supported, particularly by students themselves, but it is the right thing to do. And we make no apologies from taking a tough stance on issues such as mobile phones in schools, particularly where they are either A, a distraction, or B, can be the source of bad behaviour or the encouragement of it.
In situations like this, though, I mean, where somebody is taking vision like this on their mobile phone, should they be going to the police in the first instance with this vision?
Well, it all depends on the context, but you would hope so, yes. You would hope so, yes. I mean, acts of violence are more often than not criminal. And when people see criminal behaviour and they've got evidence of it, they should report it to police.
Just on another issue in terms of road safety, a car smashed into a house at Dover Gardens and a woman was reported for driving without due care overnight. How disappointing is that kind of behaviour?
Well, it's not the sort of start to the new year you'd like. So we're really happy about the fact that 2022 was one of the best years, I think the best year the state's had when it comes to our road toll. You want to start the year off in the right way, and someone's clearly made some bad decisions here, or allegedly at least, and I hope that it serves as a reminder that people should always be driving with due care, not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the community around them.
Chris, could I ask you a question? Sorry. Oh, sorry. Do you have more questions?
Anything else?
No.
All good?
Chris, can I ask just what's happening in New South Wales? There seems to be more water up there. Menindee in Western New South Wales, I think the dam is at risk of overflowing there. It's at 117% reportedly. Are we worried a bit about what is happening upstream?
We're certainly keeping a close eye on what's happening in the Darling. We're aware that there's higher river flows through the Darling around those locations than what had been forecast. We're also aware that New South Wales is releasing additional water from the Menindee Lakes, and that's around 10 gigalitres a day. It takes around 5 to 6 weeks for those flows to reach South Australia, so we won't see that influence our flows across the border until early February. So at this stage it may increase the time frame for those elevated flows, but we're not too concerned at this stage.
In regard to the restrictions on the river, when could they be lifted? At what point in terms of the flows would we see those lifted?
We've been working very closely over the last 4 or 5 days with South Australia Police and officers from the Department of Infrastructure and Transport. This morning at 11:30 the State Emergency Centre is meeting to consider a framework that we hope to make some announcements about tomorrow in relation to how that's going to be managed.
Have you heard about any blackwater events occurring upstream so far?
We haven't seen any confirmed fish kills in South Australia at this stage. Clearly over the border there have been some very large fish kills which have been well reported in open source media. Generally we expect to see the blackwater flow through as we have more drainage off the floodplains, and we see more organic matter and a higher organic content load in the river itself. So we'd be expecting to see that towards the end of January into February.
Is there any indication that the extent of the peak is dissipating as
No, the modellers in Environment and Water have done a really great job in terms of forecasting the flows. We continue to have increased confidence as the peak travels down the river. What has been a bit challenging has been that variability with river heights for the given flows, but certainly our confidence around the modelling with the flows is very high. But as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing some locations where the river levels are significantly higher than what we would have otherwise modelled, and we've got our focus on that sort of Lock 1 Blanchetown area at the moment in terms of what the peak is going to look like on the ground when it reaches there.
The water might stack up a little higher than you'd expected.
Correct. We're certainly seeing that now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I started writing down numbers and I had more numbers than there were numbers. 4,004.
$190.